Yeah, question? Hold on one second. Yeah. Let's do this after class to be able to get started. If anybody has issues with their assignment that they're working on, the one that's due today, just hang out for a few minutes after class if you have time, and I'll help you out, okay? Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so get brackets open on your computers. Get a new directory set up for today. Today's the 17th. Okay, so let's get an HTML shell here going. And then don't forget that we're going to start including this viewport meta right here. So get to this point where you have an ex1.html. So make your folder for today. Open up brackets. Set the working directory to that folder, all that sort of stuff, and then let's go ahead and get started. I want to get through about 5 examples today. The first example is kind of long. I'm sorry, the second example is kind of long, but the other ones are kind of short. But the second example is going to be the basis for your assignment. For any of you that haven't had me before, for the most part, like you probably noticed on the other assignment, what I do is I do kind of an example that's a very bare bones and like skeleton example, and then your job is to actually fill it out with real content and try to make it look more like a website. Okay, so that's the general theme of the class, and that's how we're going to handle things today as well. Okay, so links. So let's talk a little bit about Flexbox. I feel like something's wrong with my browser that it's asking me to translate English.
Same. It's always fun when I put up Ipsum. It's just like, would you like to translate?
I wonder if because I use so much lorem ipsum, it thinks that I'm Latin. Or
Yes, that's exactly what's happening.
Oh God, can you imagine translating just all lorem ipsum after that?
I'm just gonna do never for any. Can I do never anything?
No, actually,
Never.
translate and this is the weirdest language I've ever seen. Because it's trying to get. I did this
Okay, so let's briefly talk about Flexbox. So going back, hold on, let's make sure we're actually recording here. Everything's good. Okay. So going back to all the way back to CGS1821, I know it's been a while for some of you. In that class, you just kind of learned the basics of like HTML, some CSS, some other terminology and history of the web and stuff like that. And you don't tend to really talk about layout too much. I know when I teach it, I don't really teach almost anything about layout. Did anybody do layouts in the version they took with anybody? Are they pretty much all the same? Okay. And then you took a course, I think Professor Gibson mostly taught it. It was like GRA 37 something. And I'm pretty sure in that class you don't talk about layouts either, right? You mostly talk about like JavaScript and all that. So now we're going to actually start to talk about layouts, like positioning things on screen and where you want to put them. And this gets a little bit tricky because a lot of times there's like 10 different ways to do things. And so I'm starting to evolve on this a little bit. So last week's examples were, do I have last week's stuff? Anyway. So the stuff that you did for assignment number 2, these are slightly older techniques. They're still useful, but it's basically like taking, what I want to do early on in the course is take stuff you already know and learn how to do layouts. So for example, most people in here know how to do floats, right? You learned floats in probably Professor Gibson's course. And so you learn about floats, and then, oh, well, here's something you can do with floats is that you can put the content side by side and sort of kind of make like a column type thing with it. Now we have modern methods. For a while, I was a little bit hesitant about overly emphasizing them, but from now on, for the rest of the course, we're just going to start using those methods because they're pretty much supported by the browsers. Like today we're going to talk about Flexbox. There's a site called Can I Use? And this is a really cool site because what happens is a lot of times is that like W3C, the standards body for all this, they release a standard and then it's often unclear whether a lot of the browsers actually support it. So what you can do here is like, say for example, the thing we're going to start using is called Flexbox. Yeah, here we go. Flexible box layout module. And it's cool. It actually gives you a percentage. So here it's saying global users, but oftentimes I mean, if you're doing something local, you probably don't actually need global. I think there's a setting here that you can just set it to the US. But 96%, that's pretty decent. So for the most part, the browsers that you're going to be interacting with probably support Flexbox. So I don't know what this is, with this plus 1%, but it's in the upper 90%. What you'll notice is that almost nothing ever reaches 100% because amazingly somehow there's on some corner of the web there's always somebody using a 15-year-old web browser. So it's kind of logarithmic. It's never really gonna, grow. It just keeps on growing slower and slower and slower. But anyway, pretty cool site. But in this case, we can see that this is in the upper 90s, so we can start to use this a little bit more. So there's a site under links. It says, and I'm moving kind of fast here, Flexbox. And I've got this other site that has some examples too. But we'll talk about cards a little bit. But I'm going to focus on this. Okay, so this site, CSS Tricks. And this is very comprehensive, but I've noticed when I was starting off with Flexbox, there were like 3 or 4 really, really useful features. Like Flexbox, just like with a lot of the other things in CSS, that there's a million ways that you can use it. But really, if you just focus on a few core features, you can do a lot of cool things while you're still learning it. Okay, but let's learn the basic terminology. Is that we've got something called a container, and then we've got our items inside of that container. Does that make sense? So think of almost maybe like if we were doing an unordered list, the container would be the UL, and then our items would be the individual LIs, the individual list items, okay? But it doesn't have to necessarily be a list. We can have a container div with a bunch of divs inside, or a container header, and then a bunch of paragraphs or something, whatever. Just any sort of like block level element generally works pretty well. And you can see here, we can do all kinds of really cool things with this, but it's very comprehensive. So let's just go ahead and open up brackets. So everyone's at this point, you've got an example 1. You've got it saved, everybody's ready to go. We're running a little bit late here. Okay, so let's, inside of the head section, and I know sometimes I have to move a little bit fast because of just the structure of the course, but don't forget, at any time if you fall behind, I always post the examples to Blackboard, okay? Everyone knows that, right? That's not news to anyone? Okay. That way you can, so still type along and still follow along, but sometimes I've realized, you know, you're just gonna, some people are gonna fall behind, make a mistake. That way you have the original examples. Okay, so we need our container and our individual items. Oops, we'll do singular. Okay, so we're gonna have these two classes. And I think we did something like this last week.
Yep.
But let's just kind of as a refresher, we'll very quickly go through this. Actually, no, they don't have that feature. Okay. Some of these new text editors, you can just type like div and then hit tab and it'll expand out the div for you, but I'll manually write it. And then let's have some divs with the class item. And these are going to be essentially empty divs. So we'll do 4 of these. So right now all I added was our style inside of the head section, container class and an item class, and then I've got my container out here, and then our individual items. By the way, these are just common names. There's nothing, you don't have to call this container. It's just like, as you can see here, it's just kind of a common, just a common name. We always use that very generically. Anytime we're holding some content, we just call it a container. Okay. And then these individual items, let's just make a fixed width box. So we'll give it a width of 150 pixels, height of 150 pixels. Give it some sort of background color so we can actually see these things. We'll go with green yellow today. Give it a border. And then everyone knows what the border radius property does, right? I think I actually even had to use it on your assignment. Just kind of gives you rounded borders. So let's do that so we can see where the boxes end. It just makes it a little bit easier to see. Let's go for a pretty strong border here, or border radius. All that's going to give us is a box. It just makes life a little bit easier that we can actually see our individual items. So inside of the head section, we set up our style. 2 classes, one class called container, one class called item. Bunch of properties here, but basically essentially all we're doing is making a box. And then we've got our container and individual items. Now here's the important part. So that's all just boilerplate setup stuff. And we can view it just to see what it looks like, but there's probably not going to be very much to see. Okay. So this is the normal document flow, is that we've got a bunch of divs, and divs are block. So what it does is it does a div, goes to the next line, next line, next line, because these are all block level. So what's the opposite of block level? Inline, remember? And then what's the difference between block level and inline? What does inline do? So block level block level tag jumps to the next line. Inline stays on the same line. So think of things like strong and emphasis. If I put a strong tag in the middle of a paragraph, it doesn't cause my paragraph to jump to the next line. However, if I use something like a div or a paragraph, it causes it to jump to the next line. A little bit of terminology. Make sure you know things, little things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and, so we've got our container and items. Now the simplest usage of this Flexbox is just, there's a property called display, and actually can take a bunch of different values. Okay, but the one we're going to be working with is Flexbox, so we just say display is flex. And just by adding that one property, now we have all these different options available. Okay, so you can see here it actually is acting a little bit different now. It's like, okay, before it was kind of set up in a column. But this is really cool because now what we can do, if you kind of browse through here, just by enabling that display flex, all the things available here we can start using. Just a note on this, this site's been around, gosh, for probably at least 5 years. It's a pretty useful little site. But their layout can be, I've gotten used to it because I've used it a bunch of times. On the left-hand side, these are all the things that we do to the container class. And on the right-hand side, this is all the things that we're going to do to the items. For the most part, for now, we're gonna stay focused on what you can do to the container. Okay. So what you can see is by setting certain things on the container, like if we want to reverse our content, there's a property called flex direction. So normally it goes this way, but we can set it the other way. And then there's another, so there's row versus column. So by default, it gives us a row, but we can switch back and forth between a row and a column. So let's do that. Let's set that property. It's called flex direction. And so right now it's set to row. The default is row. But we can switch back and forth as needed. And this is nice because without actually making major structural changes to our code, just by setting this one property, we can completely reflow and reset up our content. To do something like this without Flexbox, you're going to be digging into the HTML and doing all kinds of other crazy stuff. It's just not. It becomes somewhat messy. Like you might be able to do it with pure CSS. You're not going to be doing it in one line of code. Then we have some other properties. So let's set it back to row. And this takes a lot of defaults. The default is row, but I just want you to see that's available. Now we have this other thing here, justify content. So by default, it's flex start. Say I wanted to center these. Now, how many people have centered things in CSS before? It's kind of a pain for anybody who's done it. Has anybody in your previous classes centered things? And it's generally a pain, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's not fun. Well, with this, all we have to do is, sorry, I forget the name of the property. It's justify content. Justify content, center, and that easy, all of our content is centered. We don't have to do all kinds of crazy stuff with margins or anything like that. It's very, very useful.
Thank you, Lord.
Yeah, it helps a lot. And I think, well, I don't want to waste too much time. We'll keep on moving forward. So we have that. We also have space between, space around. And I think this was the last example we did this last class, right? So this would be space between. I'm sorry, space around, and then we can do space between. Now think about this, is that if you've got some sort of navigation on your site, these might be links. So a lot of times we use like these just blocky divs, but kind of get creative in your mind and say, what could this represent? This could represent navigation. This could represent cards and so on, okay? So any questions about just those basic things? And you'll see that we can do a lot of other things here. We'll talk about this, but we can actually align items if we want to align them to the top or to the bottom, or do we want to center or stretch them? How we want to wrap things around when we're aligning. So we can do a lot of really cool things with this. And then that's not even getting into the other side where we're actually setting properties on the individual items, where you can have items, like for example, this item would be twice as wide as the other two items. You can do some pretty cool things. But let's do this. A lot of times I can show you, every little detail about Flexbox, but to me, it's usually easier just to make a website and then insert Flexbox as we go. So let's go ahead and do that. So any questions on just these couple of basic things? Just this idea of enabling Flexbox. Our two directions are either going to be row or column. And then justifying content. Everyone's pretty good? Okay. So let's go ahead and start up a new example. Let's paste in HTML shell. Make sure you have that setting set. This width is device width and the initial scale is 1. I'll admit I've forgotten to put that in the past, and it's like you're going crazy, like why isn't my code working right? And it's because it's not scaling properly on mobile devices. That's all this is just related to mobile devices. So if you were just testing on your desktop, it would probably look fine. But as soon as you try to actually view the site on a mobile device, it would look, you'd have some issues with it. So now we are going to learn some more powerful techniques for this example. But for assignment number 2, I want you to just stick to the example we did in that class period. Does that make sense? So even though like I might show you some shortcuts now, don't resort to those shortcuts because I want you to give it a taste of, a little bit, like show you how to do the same thing multiple ways so you kind of have a bigger toolbox to, grab from. Okay. So it's going to be the same basic type of site where we've got some sort of banner, some content, footer, all that sort of stuff. So let's just start with the banner. This is the way I generally work. We're probably going to use too many divs. We probably want to get into using things like headers and footers and section and all that. For now, just to keep life simple, I'm just going to use a lot of divs, okay? And actually, let me do this. I'm going to work from the inside out. So we know we're going to have to... We want some sort of banner that says Indian River State College. And then let's go ahead and give that a class of banner. Inside the head section, let's go ahead and add style. And let's think of how we want our banner to look. Well, a very common thing in like modern design is where they do the dark background light text. So we'll just stick to that. It's a fairly simple technique and it makes it easy to demonstrate during class. So we've got our banner. So we're going to say the background color is something dark. Doesn't really matter. Do we have something dark bluish that sort of looks like the IRSC blue? Slate blue? We'll try that. And then the text is going to be white, so dark background, light text. And then we bold the text. Make the text really big because it's a banner. And then so you see what we have so far. Probably want to add some padding around that. Let's do 10 pixels. Now what do you notice along the edges here? So by default, the body tag and the HTML tag have a little bit of padding. So a very common thing to do is just go ahead and set it to have no padding. So let's go ahead and do that. So for body and HTML, let's just go ahead and set it to have no padding. And now body, let's padding and margin. This just kind of gives us a complete reset. I think we're good now. That goes right up to the edge, right? My perspective, it does. Okay. So I don't want to move too fast. Let's take a 30-second, make sure everyone's 30-second break. Is everyone caught up, or do you need me to scroll to a certain part?
Got it. Okay.
Everyone's good?
Go ahead.
This class is always one of the most difficult to teach, is because like a lot of this is super verbose, and so we do a lot of typing, and so I always feel bad if anybody's a little bit slow at typing, but
The typing actually helps me like remember things.
oh, that's good.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay. So one of the techniques we learned is, remember we talked about this idea of kind of having a container? So I don't necessarily want this to be the full width of the page. A very common technique is to, again, put it in some sort of container. So let's go ahead and make a container. We're going to say container. The width is going to be 600 pixels of this container. Margin auto. And all this is going to do is this is just, I say container, this is just a very generic term. It's just going to, by itself, it doesn't really do anything. It just holds stuff. Now let's do this. So we're going to wrap this banner inside of a div. So added this container class. And let's try this. So we'll say class is equal to container. And what do you notice that happened? The whole thing is kind of inside the container. But it's pretty common on websites to have this inner portion inside of the container, but the outside background extend the full length. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? Where it's like this background will extend the full length of the page like we had before. So what do you think we could change to get that effect? To where the background extends the full length of the page, but that the banner portion, the Indian River State College, that's. So what if we did this? What if we had the banner class on the outside and then the container on the inside? I think this is right. Hold on. Yeah, there we go. And so what this does is it sets up this background color, and it says, okay, this background color is going to be the full width, but then the actual text, that's just going to be inside of this container here. That's just going to be 600 pixels wide. So we get this kind of cool effect. And you can add more padding. This is probably not enough padding, but I'm gonna try not to get too caught up in the details, okay? So is everyone good with that, with setting up a header? So going once, going twice, everyone's good? Okay. So let's move on to, I'm gonna go down here. So we've finished our banner. Let's go ahead and make some navigation now. Okay, so if we're gonna be doing navigation, we know that we want to use this nav class. And then a very common thing to do is to make an unordered list with a bunch of list items. So let's have, let's say 5 links. And we're not going to make real links. We'll just write link 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But obviously, it wouldn't take that much more to make real links, but I'm just trying to save some time here. So we've got our nav. That way, search engines can pick it up, and people who are using like screen reader software because maybe they are legally blind. And we did something like this last week. Remember where we got these links with the bullets and stuff? But now we can actually start to style this. Okay, so let's do this. We don't want to style it on the nav. What we actually want to do is style on the unordered list, because whatever we style on the unordered list is going to apply to the list items. If we style it on the nav, that's like a little too far away from the actual items. Does that make sense? So if we style things on the UL and we try to use anything related to like Flexbox, these are the direct descendants, so we can do things on that. But if we try to style it on the nav only has one direct descendant, okay? So long story short, what we're going to do is we're going to put the class on this UL. So we're going to say class, and then we're just going to call it primary nav. And then we'll go ahead and style that. See if I can fit both on the screen at the same time. Okay. So we've got our navigation down here. And then up here, I want to add our class called primary nav. And remember, just by setting this display flex, all of a sudden it's going to go from being vertical to horizontal. It's going to go from its normal flow to, it's going to flow like a row. Now you may not realize it and see it that well, but there's those little dots there. Does anybody remember how to get rid of those bullets? There's a special CSS property. I heard somebody say it. Say it louder. Be confident.
List style type none.
Perfect. So we say list style type none. And then now all of a sudden those little bullets have gone away. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and justify the content. Remember we did that before. So justify content space between. And that kind of spreads everything out. But let's say, for example, we don't want the website to take the full width of the screen. So what can we wrap it in? What's that special class that we made earlier? If we only want it to be 600 pixels wide. So you can wrap it in this class container. So anything that we wrap in this class container is going to be 600 pixels wide. So what we can do, go down here. And we could put it here. We'll put it here. So we'll say class is equal to container. And then now rather than spanning the full width of the page, we have that. Now you'll notice some things don't quite line up right here. So we have to do, you probably remember this, I think we did this last class, is that we have to set, we basically have to set it to have no padding. Because by default, that list is going to have some padding. So not every, but most elements are going to have some sort of default styling. So that list, to make room for those bullets, has some default styling. So by setting under primary nav, by setting it to 0 pixels, this lines up a little bit better. Okay. Now granted, you could do something with this if you wanted to have it completely centered. Right now it's kind of like a left align, but we'll just leave it like this for now. Okay, so we've got kind of a navigation going here. It's very simplistic, but we've got a banner. We've got some basic navigation. It's responsive, so what we can do is once we hit 600 pixels, it doesn't act that great. We'll fix that in a second. Notice it kind of acts weird. We'll fix that in a second. But it's responsive, so that's good. And anyway. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add, we talked about these things last time, cards. Okay, so basically a card is, I really like whoever designed the Audubon Society needs like a pat on the back, because a lot of websites these days are very like, they're using whatever is hip at the moment, and the Audubon Society looks good and is functional, which is really, really rare. But I always joke that like I'm not that into bird watching or anything, but I always use the Audubon Society because it's the last thing on earth that offends nobody. I've never seen anybody be offended by a bird, so. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something called a card. This whole thing is a card. It's basically you have some sort of div with some content inside. In this case, it's a picture. They've got a title, like maybe. So this whole thing you might wrap in an article, and then you've got like a picture, and then maybe like an H1, and then some other text, and then a link. So I'm gonna start using this term very loosely, but when I say card, this is essentially what I mean. So everybody good with that? So let's go ahead and make a blank card. We don't really have time to fill it out, but let's do this. So we're gonna have two cards. So we're gonna have, this is gonna be a first card. And we're just gonna write something very generic. It's just gonna say card content. So we're going to have these two cards. And our card class is just going to be like it's going to be like a box like we did before. Okay, so we've got these two cards. Let's go up here and let's go ahead and make a class. And let's go ahead and we'll give it no margin. Get rid of any margin associated with it. The width, so right now our container is 600 pixels. A lot of times there's like little stray pixels here and there. So what I like to do generally is just do it like slightly less than 600. So maybe like make the width 290 pixels. And then kind of makes it kind of boxy, so just height 300 pixels. But for your assignment, you can adjust the height, you can adjust a lot of the things. And let's just give it a border so we can actually see the outline of our card. Actually, we don't need the margin. I don't know, I was thinking. Sorry. So we're just going to give it width, height, and border. And let's do 1 pixel solid. Okay, so we've got our card class. It's going to be a width of 290 pixels because we're going to have two of them. And 290 plus 290 is a little bit less than 600, so we've got a little bit of buffer to work with. The height doesn't really matter too much. I just kind of made these square. And then the borders so we can actually see the outline. And so down here, we have our class is card and card. Okay. So we're almost there. We're getting there. So what we can do is wrap it inside of another div because we want these things to be side by side, and we're going to call that content. So not container, we're going to call this content because this is going to be like the main content of our page. It's not going to be header content, it's not going to be footer content. Bless you. So we've got this content class here. This is kind of like our parent class, and these cards are almost like the item. So let's go ahead and use some Flexbox here because right now they're stacked vertically. I want to put these things side by side. So let's go up here, make another CSS class, and this is going to be called content. And all we're going to do is we're going to display flex. And let's just see what that does for us, just by turning on display flex. Remember, we talked about this before, is that now the content is side by side. Now this content's all the way over to the left-hand side of the screen, but maybe we want to put it inside of the container so that it's all lined up with the rest of this stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. What we can actually do is that you can apply classes multiple times to a single div. So here I want to say it's inside of under this right here where we've got our cards. I want to say I want it to be content, and I also want it to be container. And then that'll bring it toward the center here. Let me click off of this. Okay, so now you see it's very distinct, like where all this stuff is lining up. But you'll notice it's kind of pushed together. Notice it's not really lining up with link 5. So what we might want to do is kind of push it apart, space it evenly. So what we can do is if we go back up to content, we can do justify content space between, just like we did with our navigation. And then now all of a sudden we've got stuff that lines up. And then so what you'd do on, like, say for example on an assignment, is go back and take these very empty, boring divs and start to actually put some real content inside of that. Okay, so like hopefully you kind of see the pattern is like we'll do an example like this in class where I'll make a very like wireframe bare bones skeleton page, and then you'll take these basic techniques, go back, and I'll give you little extra things to do here and there. Like in your assignment, rather than having 2 cards, you have to have 3 cards. Okay. We'll talk about this property in a little bit, but this will help you on the assignment. I'm not going to explain what it does, but I'm going to say align items stretch. This may help some of you on your assignment. I'm not going to explain what it does right now. Either at the end of class we'll get to it, but I have other things that we want to get through here. So hopefully you can see we're kind of getting there. This is like, it doesn't look like a finished site, but it's sort of getting the layout of something we could use for a finished site. Like we could have our links up here. You could put the content. I'll show you later on how to make things like this where you have like something that takes up 2/3, 1/3, something like that. But even though it may not seem like it, this is basically the layout of the Audubon Society's website. They've got a more complex navigation, but they're essentially doing the same thing. They're using these cards, but they're essentially doing the same thing. You get the idea? Now, one thing that would be really nice is that as I get to a mobile device, I want to take these various cards. They shrink and shrink and shrink, and then they collapse down to one column. Now, because we're using Flexbox, remember, we have this little trick where we can either point it in the row direction or in the column direction. Does everybody remember last week we talked about media queries? Is it still kind of fresh? So the idea of a media query is that at certain device resolutions, you can have different CSS. So what it'll do is, this is the normal CSS. This is how our site normally looks. And then we usually put these media queries at the bottom. Then what we can do is we can say, at media, if you're at all weak on this, you don't have to be perfect at it, but if you're at all weak, just go to W3 Schools. They have some pretty good tutorials on it. Screen and max width 600 pixels. So we're saying, okay, everything above here, this is going to be normal CSS. But as soon as we hit 600 pixels, which is kind of like a rough, we're kind of getting into mobile device territory. There are more formal descriptions of what are called breakpoints, but I'm just being kind of lazy. There are sets of like, tablet, large mobile, small mobile, and so on. But 600 pixels is a good round number to work with. Then what I want to do is I want to say, okay, remember this class we had here called content? What I want to do is take these cards and I want them to go from flexing in the row direction to the column direction. Okay, and you can see here content, we already set it up with flex. So it should be as simple as saying, oops, not container, content, flex direction is going to be column. Now notice that we didn't have to override anything else. So it's saying, okay, from this content class, the only thing I want to change is this flex direction. So normally by default flex direction is going to be row. We could even explicitly write it if we wanted to be, see exactly what's going on. But here we're saying I want the direction to point in column direction. And now this is cool because what we can do is you'll see like a calculator, a width calculator up here on the top. As soon as we hit 600 pixels, it forced it into here. Now that's not perfect because you'll notice on the Audubon Society, what did it do? What's that? Yeah, it used the full width. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So right now this is a little bit rough looking. So let's go ahead and change some other things. So what we're going to do is that normally the card has a fixed width of 290 pixels. Well, once we hit mobile devices, let's just say, we don't really want to fix a width of pixels anymore. Let's just go ahead and say that the width is just going to be the full width. It's just going to be 100%. Let's take a second for a breather. I know I'm kind of jumping through this. Does anybody need me to scroll to a certain portion? Am I moving way too fast for anybody? I know I'm moving a little bit fast. Okay, so let me slow it down here a little bit. Okay, so what we've done is we've got our HTML that we set up here, and then we've got these classes up here. What I'll do is this will get posted after class, and you'll also have the lecture. We're kind of running a little bit up on time here. For the rest of the example, I'll move a little bit slower, but you can watch the lecture and then grab the source code and go through it again. But what's going on here is that we've got our content, okay, and then we've got our cards inside of that. And what we said was when we hit mobile devices, we want it to go from row to column, right? Because the default of this is going to be, row, so we don't have to actually say it, but here, saying the default direction is row. And as soon as we hit mobile devices, we want to move it to column direction. And then now we're saying that we want the card to be 100%. So now when we move, once we hit that 600 pixels, okay, but you'll notice this like weird shrinking effect that's going on here. So what we want to do is anything defined inside of the container. Remember we did this technique, we had a fixed width and margin auto, and that centers it. But once we're below 600 pixels, it starts to act weird, because if we're at 500 pixels and we're saying that the container is 600 pixels, it starts to act weird. So let's do this. When we're on a mobile device, let's say that the container is going to be, just the width is going to be 100% instead of fixed pixel width. And rather than margin auto, let's just set it to 0 pixels. I know that's a lot to take in. Like as usual, it's recorded, and I'll put the code examples on the website. But I just wanted, I like to do complete examples, because I know a lot of times in class, they'll do like these little examples in isolation. It's like, okay, how do I go from that to a website? And then now this is a little bit more complete, because we've got our site here. And as soon as we hit 600 pixels, everything kind of merges down to 100%. And then notice we don't end up with weird shrinking issues. Okay, and this wraps properly. So I'll do a quick overview. I have a feeling some of you might have to watch it a couple times before you really get it. But the basic idea is that we started off with a banner. Okay, and then on our banner, we said, okay, we want the background color. We just basically set some styling. We said, okay, we want the background color to be like a dark blue, and the text color to be white, bold, make it larger, all that stuff. And then we made a class. So we've got this class we created up here called container. I'm sorry, that one was a banner. So you can see all that. Now, initially it spanned the full width of the page, and like last week we talked about that, you know, we can do this thing where we have a fixed width div and center it by setting margin to auto. And we called that the container class. So what we did is we said, okay, that container is going to be a fixed width and margin auto. That way it's kind of in the center of the page. Notice that this is in the center of the page, and no matter what device resolution we have, it stays unchanged, which is great for desktop. Okay. Now we did some stuff with navigation, but basically it was just taking that navigation and turning it into a bulleted list into like a proper navigation. And then we had our cards, and so these cards were kind of like these things from the Audubon Society. Okay, so these would be examples of cards. And then by themselves, the cards weren't that useful, so what we did was we wrapped it in a class called content, which is going to be the main content for our whole page. And we set that Flexbox property on it, and then we just did some basic things on how it's going to expand and wrap around and stuff. And then finally what we did is we said, okay, now we need to make this mobile ready. And I set up a CSS media query. And the idea is that anything between these curly braces, if this isn't if this is foreign to you, watch last week's lecture. We covered media queries, where W3 Schools has some info on it. I'll send out some other links too, maybe some YouTube links on some of these subjects as well, if anybody is like a little bit behind. And then we said, okay, well, normally our cards, so we have our cards, and they're inside of a container called content. So we've got our cards, and then that's surrounded by content. And as soon as we hit a mobile device, we want that content to flex the direction in column. So it's not going to be a row anymore, it's going to be a column. Now also notice what happened to these two cards. These guys right here are the cards. They changed their width to 100%. So they took up the entire, they basically filled their width. And then finally that main container, remember before is a fixed width container. Before container on desktop is normally 600 pixels and centered with auto. But once we hit a mobile device, it's very common on mobile devices just to say, hey, we've already got a limited amount of screen real estate. Let's just use up as much of that screen real estate as possible. Okay, so that's essentially what we did with that example. Okay, any questions? Everyone kind of gets the general overview? Yeah.
So you said the video for this class will be on the website. Where will the source be?
I usually put it under class examples. So you can see like last week's code is there. Let's briefly go over the new assignment. So I gave you a little bit more time in this because I think we kind of made up the time we needed to from the hurricane. Don't get 2 and 3 confused. They are somewhat similar, but for assignment 2, make sure you're using, there's an example from last week. Does anybody remember the example that this kind of correlates with? It's one of the examples.
I think it's example 1.
Okay, so example 1, if you follow that, that gets you like 80% of the way there, right? For those, how many people completed assignment number 2 already? And that pretty much was the case, right? It got you like 80% of the way there, and then you just kind of have to fill in some details. Assignment number 3 is the same thing. I want you to take this website, the web page that we created in class today, and you have to make some modifications. So I want you to, so our layout has 2 cards. What I want you to do is make it have 3 cards. Well, if each of our cards are about 300 pixels and our width is 600 pixels, that's not going to work anymore, right? So what am I going to have to do to the card? The card can't be 300 pixels anymore. What does it need to be? Yeah, 200. And what I like to do is shave off a little bit extra, so maybe like 195, just to give yourself a little bit of margin. Okay. So change it from 2 cards to 3 cards. Fill it out a little bit like they've done on the Audubon Society. Put an image. Have we talked about like these sites like Lorem Pixel?
You showed us one.
Yeah.
Okay. Just go ahead and use Lorem Pixel for that, and just find an image that kind of fits. So you're more than welcome to use that. Do I need to explain it, or does everyone feel comfortable with it? Okay. So just fill out that card a little bit. Add a footer. So remember on assignment 2, that's the same thing. The footer is going to be very similar to the header. It's going to be like a full width background color with maybe some bold but smaller text, and maybe just write something basic like copyright 2019. You don't really have to fill out the footer too much. Now here's the thing that's going to, this is kind of where the difficulty for most people is going to be, is that in our example, notice how we collapsed the card content from row to column. Bless you. So right now it's a row, and then once we hit mobile device, it's a column. On many mobile sites, what do they do with the navigation? They don't usually have the navigation like this, right? What do they have it instead? It's often vertical. See if the Audubon Society did that. They probably did. Here we go. So notice how their navigation is vertical. So what you need to do on your assignment is to take like navigation like ours, where it's normally set up as a row, and then at the breakpoint, set it to where it's a column. So that's essentially one line of code, and you already had that code because we did it with the card. Okay, it should be pretty straightforward. Now, in the past, people have gotten really slick about this, and they said, okay, notice how we have this like show hide button. For your assignment, it's not actually required, but usually there's like maybe 2 or 3 really advanced people in the class. If you know a little bit of JavaScript, it turns out this is really easy to do. This is not a JavaScript class, so it's not a requirement, but usually about 2 or 3 people in the class will do this. So you're more than welcome to do this show hide. It's a very easy thing to look up. If you just Google show hide JavaScript, it's probably going to be copy-paste code, but it's not going to be required, so don't worry about it. Okay, so any questions on this assignment? So that took a little bit longer. We're here till 10:15, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me try to get through 1 or 2 very, very quick examples, just so we get some more experience with Flexbox. I realize this was a lot, but I want to get into the habit of giving you full web pages, because I know a lot of times in these classes, like, you get little tiny bits of an example, and it's like, okay, how do I take that and make a web page? And these can take a while to do, but I think it's good to have a full example and not just a bunch of tiny examples. Okay, so let's do this. So let's go to HTML shell, make sure viewport meta is set. And I think I probably only have time for one more example. So let me think which one's best to do here. Okay, this one should be pretty quick. So one of the things that we can do with this Flexbox is we can actually wrap content. This is pretty cool because if you're making like a responsive site that you want it to work on mobile devices, if you've got a lot of content on the page, you may want the content to automatically wrap around. Now we have something else called grid, which we're going to address later. Grid might be a little bit better of a method to do this, but Flexbox wrapping content, that's a pretty useful thing. So let's go ahead and set up our boilerplate here. So we're going to have our style tag, and then within that we're going to have a container and item. By the way, don't freak out. This new assignment, you have 2 weeks on it, okay?
Yay!
Does anybody feel like they're going to need an extension for the current assignment, or do you feel like you can raise your hand if you think?
I might need at least a day. I can have it done by tomorrow.
So let me do this across the board. It's 48 hours. Is that good for everybody? Everyone feels like they can really get it done. So if I did a 2-day extension, so that means it would be due by midnight on today's Tuesday. So 11:59 Thursday night.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'll go ahead and I'll set that after class. So let's go ahead and do this. We're going to have our container, and anytime we have this container, we have to set it to flex. And then let's just make a kind of a very boxy item. So the width is going to be, let's do 80 pixels, height, 80 pixels, oops. Let's give it a background color so we can actually see what we're working with. Something dark cyan, perfect. And then I like using these border radiuses because it makes the boxes a little bit easier to see. So we're going to say border radius is 25 pixels again. So we're going to have a div. And then so I'll give everyone a second to catch up. All I did was in the head section, I set up some styling. And then below, we've got a container with, right now it's one item, but I'm just going to copy and paste and make a bunch of items. So let's do this. Imagine if I'm like an e-commerce site and I have like an Amazon and I have a bunch of things I'm trying to show. Like, I want to fit as many items on a page as possible. So let's do this. Let's just copy and paste a bunch of items. Not any specific number, let's just say a bunch. That should be good. And I know the hybrid format, it's tough. What I'll do is after class, I'll go to, I'll also post some YouTube videos too of just some basics on Flexbox and that sort of stuff. Media queries, just so you can get the basic idea, okay?
Can I see the style type again? Thank you.
Don't worry, you're not late for your next class. The time on the max is wrong. It's 10:09.
I wasn't worried about that.
Okay, is everyone good? So if we view this, what do you notice? It kind of shrinks and it doesn't actually keep these at, what did we say? I think these are like 25 pixels wide or whatever. It just keeps on trying to shrink it, which is not super useful. But there's one of these flex properties that what we can say is that once you've run out of room, wrap it around. And conveniently enough, it's called flex wrap. And by default, it's set to do not wrap, so no wrap. But let's go ahead and set it to wrap. Now what you'll notice is that when it runs out of room, this is cool. It always keeps our, so in this case, these could be cards. This could be like if I'm Amazon, I could have a card with like an e-commerce item of some sort. And it's great for responsive layouts because then what I can do is things like this. I can fit, no matter what, device it is, it's just going to flow automatically for me. And it's going to keep those individual boxes the same width and height, rather than trying to shrink them. Okay, so you can do a lot of really powerful things with Flexbox, but I think that's a good stopping point today. I don't want to. I know we did a lot.
Can I see what it is? Thank you.
So the main thing for the last assignment is watch. If you're confused at all for the last assignment, watch the lecture video. Okay, don't try to use techniques that we learned today on the last assignment. Does that make sense? You're just going to confuse yourself because the idea is I set that up as assignment to match that lecture. So if you start trying to use stuff we haven't covered yet, it's just going to cause yourself problems. So watch that lecture. Make sure to use the example that we used in lecture. It should be, like I said before, it's like I give you 80%, and then you just have to extend a couple things here and there. Okay, so make sure you understand the code, but you're not going to be writing a whole lot of new stuff from scratch. You're just going to be kind of filling out a website. And then the new assignment, which is due in 2 weeks, that's going to be based off of example 2, which I realize is a very, I don't want to say complicated, but it's a longer example than we've done before. And I will post that immediately after class. And then these lecture videos, I'll make sure to have this posted by the end of the day. Okay. I hope nobody feels too lost. I know the speed is a little bit fast, but hopefully between the code examples and the recorded lectures, does that help for everybody having that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I won't keep you here any longer. Make sure to keep up in the announcements, and I'll have everything posted in the next few hours. I got to teach a class immediately after this, but make sure I have everything. Okay.